Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. In this video, I'm going to be breaking down what social justice movements mean, who they impact, how to get involved, how they're funded, and a lot of other really key components. So if you're really still struggling with what your allyship and advocacy looks like, and really just want some more information around what social justice even really means, this video is definitely for you. So make sure you stay tuned. So as always, first and foremost, we're going to start off with a loose definition because there's so many definitions for all the concepts that I talk about, but I always want you to understand what I mean when I refer to these particular terms. So I want you to think of social justice in terms of what is social injustice. When that hatred permeates throughout a society and becomes systemic, especially, then we have these social ills. We have this society that has an imbalance to it, right? Where certain groups have privileges that other groups don't have. If you haven't watched my white supremacy video, you're gonna need to do that. So we're talking about really this judgment against the society for being unfair. We're gonna advocate on behalf of this group, but it's like, for what? You have to be able to start to sort of narrow it down, and that can seem really difficult because you want to address all of these things. But in order to have an effective social justice movement, it has to be clearly defined. Me Too and also Time's Up came out of this absolute disgust and just being completely fed up with the treatment that women receive in the workplace, with celebrities really kind of being the face of that movement and stepping out to say that I've experienced assault and harassment in the workplace, that one is unique in that sense. Black Lives Matter, that did not start in 2020, that really originally started after the acquittal in the case of Trayvon Martin. It was really a movement that was born out of that space and that frustration around what is really indifference, okay, towards Black life. Right? So Black Lives Matter being the response to that indifference. Don't know how it got all complicated and turned into anything more than that. Well, I do know how, right? I do know how that happened or why that happened, but on the most fundamental level, that's the reason. And that should also show you how absolutely outrageous on a human level this particular issue is for the Black community, because why would we have to say that our lives matter? Why would we have to communicate that to another human being? I mean, what level of degradation is happening here that you would need to say, you know what, my life as a human being does matter? But that's for another video. So Black Lives Matter, of course, being, and then as I mentioned before, being more specifically focused in on police brutality, but of course encompasses, as we know, so many other issues specific to Black people in America, really across the globe, but specifically focused in on police brutality in America. Climate change has been a huge social justice movement for years and years and years, and I have a huge thing around climate change being very whitewashed. And a lot of people, when you think of climate change, you think of these white and young activists as if, you know, communities of color, Black, Indigenous, and people of color somehow are not on the front lines of climate change, when really Indigenous tribes and Indigenous peoples are really the frontline leaders around climate change. So there's a whole piece around environmental racism that's also for another video. Of course, the civil rights movement, which a lot of people also just don't understand because the curriculum has also been whitewashed around what the social justice movement was about and who the primary beneficiaries are and what elements of identity and walks of life it really was meant to address and help. It wasn't just something that said, you know, let's all have peace and love and get along. It was very specific around things like anti-lynching, right? It was really focused in on anti-violence, right? The non-violence piece was really born out of this idea that the violence being leveled against Black people is so inhumane that we must be non-violent in order to clearly demonstrate to the whole world, right, who the perpetrator is here, who is on the wrong side of this, so that there's no confusion here. And a lot of people really don't understand that and get that messaging wrong. And that's a larger conversation around around social justice movements that I'll talk about as well, when the messaging starts to shift and why that typically happens. There's also been, for years and years, decades and decades, this fight around indigenous land rights. So the United States essentially just choosing not to honor the treaties that it entered into with a number of indigenous tribes and encroaching on and just outright taking indigenous protected lands, ancestral lands, for use for commercial reasons. If you have been following it at all, there's a number of oil and gas projects that have been pushed through without any sort of community feedback, without any sort of consideration around environmental rights. And there's issues around clean drinking water that impact indigenous communities, and the list goes on. So that is very much an ongoing fight that really does need more media attention, which it never seems to get compared to a lot of other social justice movements. And of course, in my opinion, that's because it impacts indigenous peoples. There's a lot of focus on the plight of white women as it relates to women's rights, even though women of color certainly experience far more severe impacts of sexism and experience things like misogynoir, which is hatred and indifference towards Black women and women of color. And so there just isn't that media attention on social justice movements equally across the board, depending on what group they benefit and who the perceived spotlight is focused on. The gay rights movement has been ongoing as well, and is also sort of tied to the conversation around marriage equality, which had significant wins when the Supreme Court finally decided and recognized that marriage is not just between a man and a woman, that marriage is equal across the board, across gender identities. Another social justice movement where there's a huge conversation to be had around it being whitewashed, and around the voices and perspectives of individuals of color really being largely removed from that conversation, very much intentionally in a lot of ways when we think about the gay rights movement. But that all really leads me into this conversation around intersectionality. Intersectionality, I hope that you're aware. I hope you've heard this before, this concept and this term before, but even more importantly, I hope you know where it came from and who it came from, because talking about erasure, oftentimes people talk about intersectionality and they don't credit the founder of the word, right? The woman that coined this particular term. And her name is Dr. Kimberly Crenshaw. So then what typically is happening is basically the movement is saying, hey, you can come on girl, join us. But not as your full self, right? Join us as just a little piece of who you are. Don't get too loud, don't get too Black in here, right? Or don't act too much like a woman. Don't, start talking about women's issues, because we're only talking about Black issues right now. We're just talking about the community. And it's like, are Black women not a part of the community, right? It's like, what's happening here? It's just really inappropriate and just completely ridiculous to expect someone to show up to fight for some cause as only one portion of who they are and leave the other portion in their car. No. Just absolutely not. That is not social justice. That literally is contributing to social injustice, right? So when you allow that to really stand within a movement and to really permeate throughout the sort of organization internally of a movement, it's doomed. It's just going to be doomed. It is not going to work here, because you cannot, on one hand, right, call out society and condemn society for creating and causing and upholding harm to a particular identity group, when internally, as an organization, as a movement, you are essentially doing the same to another group. No, it's not going to fly, right? It's not going to fly if I have to fight for the rights of my racial identity, but I can't, talk about my sexual orientation or let that be too visible, because that distracts. Distracts from what? I'm a whole person. I have all of these identities, and I have to be allowed. I just have to be allowed to come into this space with all of those, or this is not a social justice space. The challenge here with social justice leaders, and I'm going to go there a little bit, okay? So just ride with me. The challenge, though, is that oftentimes they are self-appointed. Black Lives Matter, the visibility was just sky high across the globe because of social media and just where we are with technology. So the focus of the globe was on this particular issue. Now, naturally, that's going to be a space that is going to attract some, quite frankly, egomaniacs. You have to start asking tough questions like, why are you here? Why did you think that you would be an effective leader? What makes you believe that? What is it about your identity and your background and who you actually are that you feel makes you effective to this? We really shift into other issues in our society around like obsessing over famous people, right? This focus we have on an obsession we have on the celebrity. And that applies very much in this context of social justice leaders. They really do become celebrity. Well, don't question me. I'm doing work on behalf of the people and Beyonce is my friend, right? It's like, what does that have to do with anything? No one is above critique. No one at any point, at any level, at any position in their life as a human being is above any sort of critique and constructive criticism. Now, I'm not talking about like trolling or hating, but really honest and specific and detailed feedback that could be beneficial to the overall movement. And it really goes back to this idea that we have to always remember that these movements can never be about a person. We've seen time and again what happens when the movement is wrapped up in a person and something happens to the person, right? Either they are murdered, or they pass away for other reasons, or they have to step away, there's scandal. And what happens to the movement is that honestly, it just kind of falls apart because that was the guy, that was the person, this was the leader. We don't know how to move it forward without them. I think that's completely ridiculous. If you're talking about a social cause here, it doesn't stop with one person. We're talking about society. You're talking about something that affects millions and millions of people. How can you wrap that around just one individual? I just don't think that that's appropriate at all. We are ignoring some of the things that they are doing that are nefarious, okay? Because we're trying to pursue this cause and we think that we can't do that without this individual. You need to ask yourself, why am I doing this? What do I hope to achieve? What do I hope to contribute to this space? What elements of my identity might present a challenge or might actually be beneficial? What are you actually willing to sacrifice? That's usually when people get really quiet. They're like, let's see, giving up my privilege. Do I want to do that? Thought we were just gonna go to a rally, you know? Just gonna put up our fist. I don't know about giving up these privileges. I just don't know about that. This speaks to cultural awareness. Then you start to really recognize not just the privileges that you carry, but that you enjoy them. You like them. Right? They create that protected environment for you, that comfortable space for you, and that you wouldn't want to be without those privileges. I need to be able to relinquish those in order to create equity. That's social justice. Political scientist Megan Ming Francis talked about movement capture. So this is something that happens when large donors are not just donating, cutting the check and walking away. They're actually using these substantial donations to apply pressure and apply influence around like the content and the progression of a movement. One of the examples is in the civil rights movement, where organizations were again focused on things like anti-lynching. We're specifically calling out violence, murder of Black people, how that had shifted and evolved to conversations around education and things that would be considered or framed in the context of things like self-help. We're going to shift this conversation from calling out the violence of this group that's in power and has this privilege and has this dominance. We're going to stop calling out violent white people and instead focus on helping the Black community help itself. Number one is to keep accurate records. Keep accurate records on an organizational level, on a systemic level, in terms of what the movement has addressed, what the focus is. Somebody needs to be writing down what the goals and the objectives are, doing a SWOT analysis. Like, the notes need to be there, right? The record, the history needs to be there, because you want to look at that over time. You want to be able to go back and look and say, hey, when we first started, we just thought we were going to do this and impact this many people. And now it's grown to such a level, and you want to be able to celebrate those wins, because it can be very tireless work and thankless work. And not often enough, I feel like activists don't acknowledge that challenge and celebrate those victories. Number two is that you should truly be inclusive. So the social justice movement, again, as I mentioned, basically shouldn't be a carbon copy of the oppression that exists in society. So it shouldn't be like, white male cisgender leadership. And then, it shouldn't be this very stereotypical sort of structure and leadership in terms of diversity within the movement, because you need all of those diverse perspectives in order to achieve the goals of the movement, of the cause. If there is just an obvious lack of representation, you need to address that, and you need to address that as soon as possible, and figure out how to develop messaging that lets particular identity groups understand how your cause also applies to them. Be really transparent with your funders, individuals that are supporting you. Let them know what's happening, what's not happening. We had to change direction. We're confused. We're lost. We're having a great time. Everybody's doing awesome. Everything is going terribly, whatever the feedback looks like. But being transparent and being honest about that every step of the way is really critical, because again, this is a grassroots movement. You should engage the political structure that you have around you to a degree. You should not allow politicians to just pop up at your meeting when they're running for office and give a cute speech about how they're down for the cause. Do not allow that to happen. If you are essentially selling the movement out for some clout, no, don't do that. And then lastly, just understand that everyone has a position to play. Everyone has a role to play, right? You have to be able to step into a movement, take inventory of what's happening there. Where are the needs still? What is needed within the structure of that organization to make it successful? And then think about who you are and be able to plug into that space. And once you find your lane, stay in your lane, right? Everyone is not the leader. Everyone cannot be the leader. Everyone is not going to be the one with the microphone, with the megaphone, okay? Everyone is not going to be the face of the movement, and shouldn't be. Going back to what I mentioned about doing some vetting there, right? Everybody has a role to play though, and all the roles are equally important. It's not like, unless you're up there at the top and people can recognize you and associate you with the movement, then you're not doing anything. That is not true. Stay true to who you are. Don't step into a social justice movement and decide that this is your opportunity to step outside of yourself. Like, no, it's not. It's not at all what this is. You should remain true to who you are and honor who you are within the context of this space and the work that you do. I hope this video is really helpful for you to understand social justice, and I also hope that you find yourself getting involved in a social justice movement to some degree at some point in the future. Also, I have to put a huge plug out there for the Crawley Cultural Products that really help allies and activists in the work that they're doing. That's a huge component of folks that we work with outside of business clients. It's individuals who are heading up a lot of these movements who need some of that information and advice about how to make sure that what they're doing is in the best interest of the cause, of the movement, but also themselves. So the Social Justice Glossary is a huge part of that. If you don't understand the history of some of these movements, they are included in that Social Justice Glossary, and I encourage you to check that out. We also have posters for you to put up to make it really clear that you are supportive of certain causes and that your space is one that is going to be in pursuit of equity and justice. Also, this beautiful shirt that I'm wearing, we still have a few of those left on our website at crawleycultural.com as well. Like this video and subscribe to the channel for more videos like this. We're dropping them weekly. They're going to start coming out more frequently over the next couple of weeks as we head into 2022. So make sure that you are subscribed and that you get those notifications. And I'll see you guys next time.